My name is Zach Cliverton, and before the moon left us, I believed there were certain things a man could count on. I did not mean happiness, or health, or money, or even the people he loved, because I had lived long enough to know all of those could be taken by age, accident, cancer, divorce, carelessness, or one badly worded sentence at a kitchen table. I meant the deeper things, the things so dependable they had stopped feeling like gifts: gravity, dawn, winter, the smell of pine sap warming on a July afternoon, the Bow River running east because rivers had the decency to remember which way downhill was, the moon rising late some nights and early others, sometimes full and theatrical over the dark saw-teeth of the Rockies, sometimes only a thin white shaving caught in the branches of the spruce trees behind my house. A man living alone in the mountains makes habits out of those things. He notices the weather because weather can kill him. He notices animals because animals know trouble before men do. He notices machinery because machinery always tells the truth if you understand its language. And after 41 years as a mechanical engineer, 36 of them spent designing, repairing, condemning, and occasionally cursing industrial systems that were supposed to keep people warm, powered, ventilated, pumped, cooled, and alive. I had come to trust the honest testimony of physical things. A bearing whined before it seized. A beam sagged before it failed. Ice groaned before it broke. Water found the weak point. Steel remembered stress. The world, for all its cruelty, followed rules. I was 68 years old that October, retired for nearly 6 years, living 8 kilometers off a secondary road west of Canmore in a timber frame house I had built in my 50s, back when my knees still believed in optimism. The place sat on a bench above a narrow valley, with lodgepole pine behind it, a creek below it, and mountains all around like enormous sleeping animals. I had solar panels on the south roof, a battery bank in the utility room, a propane tank buried beyond the woodshed, 2 generators, a satellite internet dish, a ham radio setup I had promised myself I would learn properly someday, and enough tools to rebuild a tractor, a bridge, or a marriage if the other party cooperated and the parts were available. I was not a survivalist, though people from Calgary sometimes called anyone with more than one chainsaw a survivalist. I was simply an engineer who disliked depending on fragile systems designed by committees, maintained by contractors, and billed by monopolies. I kept spare filters, belts, fuses, bearings, spark plugs, hose clamps, flour, rice, beans, canned tomatoes, medical supplies, ammunition for the old .30-30 my father had left me, and more duct tape than any reasonable man should admit to owning. None of it felt dramatic. It was just what you did when the nearest neighbor was far enough away that shouting was a philosophical exercise. The day the asteroid hit the moon began with the kind of beauty that later feels obscene. The sky was cold and blue, the first snow had dusted the high ridges overnight, and the larches were burning gold in the upper slopes. I remember this clearly because I had spent the morning replacing the impeller on the small hydro intake down by the creek, a job I had postponed for too long because retirement had taught me the dangerous art of saying tomorrow. The intake screen was packed with needles and grit. The water was cold enough to make my fingers ache through neoprene gloves, and by the time I carried the old impeller back up to the house, I was muttering insults at my younger self for installing the system in a place that required scrambling over wet rock like a drunken goat. I had coffee at 2 in the afternoon, black and strong, standing at the kitchen window while a raven walked along the top rail of my deck as if inspecting my workmanship. That raven looked in at me once, head tilted, eye bright and judgmental, and I remember laughing because it seemed to know something I did not. The first alert came at 3:17 p.m. on my phone, which was lying face down beside a notebook full of pump curves and grocery lists. I almost ignored it. Most alerts were weather warnings, road closures, or government notices written by people who had never driven mountain roads in November. But this one made the phone buzz twice, then a third time, then the tablet on the counter chimed, and the laptop in my office began making the sharp little sound it reserved for emergency updates. I picked up the phone with wet hands and saw the headline from the CBC, Asteroid Impact, confirmed on far side of Moon, International Observatory's monitoring event. At first I felt curiosity, not fear. The phrase far side helped. Anything on the far side sounded safely aimed away from us, as though the moon had taken a punch on our behalf. The article was short, rushed, full of phrases like unexpected object, high velocity, preliminary estimates, ejectoplume, no immediate danger to Earth. There was a photograph from some observatory in Chile, a blurred white-gray disk with a bright smear at one edge. It looked unimpressive, like a fingerprint on a lens. By 5 o'clock, every channel had experts. I watched them while reheating stew from the night before. Astronomers with tired eyes. Planetary scientists trying not to look excited. A NASA spokesman standing in front of a blue backdrop and using the careful voice of a man trained never to say anything interesting by accident. They explained that the object had been dark, likely metallic or carbonaceous, difficult to detect because of its approach angle and the glare of the sun. They said it was estimated at between 8 and 12 kilometers in diameter, which made me set down my spoon. A rock that size did not simply hit. It converted motion into history. They said the moon had absorbed impacts before. They said the far side was heavily cratered for precisely that reason. They said there would be spectacular debris clouds visible with telescopes and possibly meteor activity if some ejecta reached Earth's orbital path. They said there was no cause for panic. That phrase came often, in slightly different clothes. No cause for panic, no evidence of threat. Models are being refined. Situation is being monitored. An engineer learns to listen for omissions, not lies necessarily. Omissions, silence around the load-bearing detail. No one said the moon's orbit was unchanged. No one said the impact energy was insignificant. No one said they knew the object's exact mass. At 6:42 p.m., one of the experts, a woman from the European Space Agency with silver hair and a face too intelligent for television, was asked whether an impact could alter the moon's orbit. She paused for less than a second, but I saw it. Then she said, "In theory, all impacts alter motion, but the moon is very massive, and meaningful orbital changes would require extraordinary circumstances." The host smiled with relief because the sentence had been shaped like reassurance. I did not smile. I took out an old envelope from the drawer, wrote down the estimated diameter, guessed at density, guessed at velocity, and began rough calculations I had no business making with grocery store arithmetic while a pot of stew cooled beside me. I came up with numbers large enough to make me uncomfortable and uncertain enough to make me angry at myself for doing them. By evening, the world had turned the impact into entertainment. Social media filled with jokes about werewolves, tides, moon cheese, and whether billionaires would try to buy the crater. Someone posted telescope footage that showed a plume rising from the far lunar limb like a white bruise blooming in vacuum. Another clip, enhanced and stabilized, showed a pulse of light so sharp it made the image sensor flare. I watched it 5 times. Then I walked outside. The air had turned hard and windless. The western peaks still held a little afterglow, but the valley had gone blue-black, and the house behind me cast warm rectangles onto the deck. The moon was not up yet. It would rise later, past 9, nearly full. I stood there in my old down jacket, hands in pockets, listening to the creak below and the ticking of cooling logs in the stove through the wall behind me. Nothing had changed. That was the terrible part. The world often gives no visible sign when something irreversible has begun. At 9:11 p.m., the moon came over the ridge. I had seen it rise thousands of times. I knew the trick of it, how it looked enormous near the horizon, especially when magnified by mountain silhouettes and human expectation. But that night, it looked wrong in a way my brain rejected before it understood. It was too bright on one edge, too dirty on the other, and around it hung a faint, uneven halo that did not belong to cloud or ice crystals. Through binoculars, the far limb seemed ragged, almost feathered. I went back inside for the spotting scope, set it on the deck with fingers that had become clumsy, and found the disk trembling in the eyepiece. For several seconds I could not breathe properly. Along the upper right curve, where the far side rolled just barely into view, a luminous haze spilled outward into space. Not much. Not like the movies. Just enough to make the moon seem wounded. I told myself it was ejecta, dust, sunlit debris. Nothing more. I told myself to stop dramatizing a physical event. I told myself every retired man living alone in the woods was entitled to one foolish moment of cosmic dread. Then he should go inside, drink tea, and behave. Instead, I stayed out there until my cheeks burned from cold and the house lights behind me seemed fragile and temporary. Sometime after 10, the satellite internet flickered out. That happened often enough in bad weather, but there was no bad weather. The modem rebooted twice, blinked green, blinked red, then settled into a slow amber pulse. I checked the router, the power supply, the dish alignment, then stepped outside again and looked up at the clean, star-punched sky. My phone still had weak service from a tower farther down the valley, so I searched for outages. Nothing useful loaded. Pages stalled halfway. Images refused to appear. Headlines came in fragments. Lunar impact debris, satellite anomalies, navigation disruptions. Agencies urge patience. At 11:38 p.m., the first deep boom rolled through the mountains. It was not thunder. Thunder moves with weather. It has shoulders and echoes and a direction you can feel. This was lower, heavier, more like a quarry blast heard through the bones of the earth. The windows trembled once in their frames. The raven, or another raven, burst from the dark trees with a harsh cry and vanished down slope. I stood in the kitchen holding a flashlight I did not remember picking up. A minute later came another boom, farther away or higher up, followed by a faint whispering hiss that seemed to move across the sky. Meteor activity, I thought. Ejecta. Lunar rock arriving home like shrapnel from a war we had not known we were in. I turned off the kitchen light so I could see outside, and in the black glass of the window I caught my own reflection. Gray beard, hollow eyes, old plaid shirt, one hand braced against the counter like a man on a ship. The radio gave me voices when the internet would not. On the emergency band there was chatter from Banff, Calgary, Edmonton, fragments of official language, and amateur fear overlapping in bursts of static, reports of bright objects breaking apart over the Pacific, GPS irregularities, communications dropouts, power fluctuations across western grids. A trucker near Golden claimed the moon had moved. Someone told him to shut up. Someone else said observatories in Hawaii were confirming a measurable orbital deviation, but the signal broke before he could finish. I sat in my office with the lights off, and the radio glow green against the shelves of manuals and old binders I had never thrown away. The moon shone through the window behind me, bright enough to lay a pale rectangle across the floorboards. I kept turning to look at it, as though it might have come closer when I wasn't watching, or farther away, or disappeared entirely. Just after midnight, the official statement changed. It came first as text, then as audio relayed by a public broadcaster whose signal faded in and out, like a voice speaking through water. The impact had produced a larger-than-expected transfer of momentum. The moon's orbit had been measurably altered. Additional observations were required before long-term projections could be confirmed. There was no immediate danger to the public. Coastal authorities were advised to monitor tidal forecasts. Satellite operators were advised to prepare for debris tracking updates. Citizens were advised to rely on official sources and avoid speculation. I wrote the words "larger than expected transfer of momentum" in my notebook, and underlined them so hard the pen tore the paper. Then I sat there listening to static. That was when I first felt real fear, not because I understood everything, but because I understood enough. Systems fail at interfaces, a shaft coupling, a weld seam, a pressure valve, a coastline, an orbit. The moon was not decoration. It was part of the machine. It pulled on our oceans, steadied our axial tilt, paced biological rhythms older than memory, and hung in the sky as the one celestial fact every child learned before learning mortality. You could not remove a component that large from a system that complex and expect only poetry to change. At 1:06 a.m., the power grid failed. My house switched to batteries without a flicker, but down in the far valley, the faint amber glow from scattered homes and highway lights vanished all at once. The darkness that followed was absolute, old, and enormous. The kind of darkness that had existed before wiring, before roads, before names. I went to the window and looked east. Nothing. Not Canmore, not the highway, not the distant industrial yard near the tracks. Only black mountains under a damaged moon. Then, somewhere far below, a dog began barking and did not stop. I should have slept. Instead, I filled containers with water, brought in more firewood, checked the battery charge, shut down non-essential circuits, inspected the generator shed, loaded the rifle, and made coffee I did not need. These were not heroic actions. They were the motions of a frightened old engineer trying to reduce terror into tasks. At 2:20 a.m., a final broadcast broke through the static, stronger than the others, as if the whole ruined night had leaned toward that one voice. It was not the calm NASA spokesman. It was not a politician. It was a man with a dry throat reading from an observatory bulletin, and behind him I could hear other people talking too loudly. The moon, he said, was receding from Earth faster than any initial model had predicted. Then the signal cut out. I waited for it to return. I waited 10 seconds, then 30, then a minute. The radio hissed. The house creaked. The creek moved in the dark below, still obeying gravity, still pretending the old rules held. I turned slowly toward the window. The moon hung above the mountain ridge, pale and scarred and impossibly calm. But now I could not look at it as a familiar thing. It looked like something departing. It looked like an eye withdrawing from the world. And as I stood alone in my warm, well-stocked, carefully engineered house in the remote Canadian Rockies, with every system I trusted humming around me on borrowed power, I understood that the first discovery was not that the moon had been struck, or wounded, or moved. The first discovery was that it was leaving. I don't believe I slept more than 20 minutes at a time that night, and what little sleep I managed came in fragments so thin they felt more like interruptions to consciousness than rest. Each time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of machinery, not people, not mountains, not the moon itself, but enormous invisible gears somewhere beneath the earth, slowly grinding out of alignment. Every engineer has dreams like that eventually. We spend our careers believing that systems can be understood if only we gather enough data, inspect enough components, eliminate enough variables, and then one day we retire and discover that the largest systems of all, the climate, the economy, aging, civilization, have no maintenance manuals. By the time the eastern horizon turned from black to charcoal gray, I had already made coffee, checked the battery bank twice, restarted the satellite modem 3 times, and walked the perimeter of the property with my rifle slung over one shoulder, more out of habit than expectation. The silence bothered me first, not because there was no sound, but because the familiar sounds were missing. The creek still murmured through the trees below the house, and the wind occasionally stirred the tops of the pines, but there were no chickadees greeting the dawn, no squirrels scolding from the branches, no distant crows arguing over breakfast. Even the ravens seemed to have abandoned their usual patrols. It was as though every animal in the valley had attended a meeting during the night and decided that whatever had happened in the sky required absolute silence. The mountains themselves looked unchanged, which somehow made everything worse. Fresh snow still clung to the upper ridges, sunlight still caught the granite faces in brilliant shades of orange and gold, and the larches still glowed as though autumn had no intention of yielding to catastrophe. Human beings expect disasters to announce themselves dramatically. We imagine burning cities, collapsing bridges, mushroom clouds, or walls of water racing toward shore. Instead, apocalypse often arrives wearing yesterday's clothes. I stood on the deck with my coffee cooling in my hands and watched the sunrise paint the peaks while trying to convince myself that perhaps the experts had overreacted, that orbital mechanics were more forgiving than my late-night calculations suggested, that the phrase receding from Earth might simply mean a few extra kilometers over several centuries. I almost succeeded. Then I noticed the tide charts. I had downloaded them years ago for no reason other than curiosity. Engineers collect information the way some people collect old coins. Somewhere in my office were manuals for steam turbines I had never owned and bridge design standards for provinces I had never worked in. Among those digital odds and ends was software that predicted tides anywhere on Earth. It relied on astronomical models, and those models updated automatically whenever the computer synchronized with official databases. Except this morning the software refused to load the latest predictions. Instead, a warning appeared across the screen stating that current astronomical parameters could not be verified. I stared at those words for a long time. Software isn't frightened. It simply compares expected values to observed ones. Somewhere, servers scattered around the world were receiving measurements that no longer matched centuries of carefully refined equations. The radio came alive shortly after 7, though alive might have been too generous a word. Most transmissions were clipped by static or interrupted entirely, as though the atmosphere itself had become unreliable. There were emergency management officials requesting status reports from remote communities, amateur operators exchanging rumors they insisted were facts, and weather stations broadcasting observations that sounded increasingly disconnected from one another. A pilot flying north of Prince George reported severe turbulence beneath perfectly clear skies. A fishing vessel somewhere off the British Columbia coast claimed tides had arrived nearly 2 hours early and far stronger than predicted. Someone in Washington state insisted their GPS receiver had placed them in central Idaho before correcting itself. Another operator dismissed the claim as faulty equipment until a third voice quietly admitted that commercial aviation was reporting navigation irregularities across western North America. No one sounded panicked. Panic comes later. What I heard instead was confusion. The peculiar, restrained confusion of professionals trying to describe events that refuse to fit established categories. I drove into town just after 8, not because I needed supplies immediately, but because experience had taught me that shortages begin long before people realize they should be worried. My old diesel pickup had nearly 3/4 of a tank, and I carried 2 approved fuel cans in the bed along with recovery straps, tools, chains, and a small compressor that had lived there for years. The gravel road leading toward the highway was unusually busy. A convoy of utility trucks passed me heading west with flashing amber lights, but no sirens. A propane delivery truck hurried east far faster than any sane driver normally attempted on those washboard corners. When I reached the paved road, I found traffic already heavier than a holiday weekend. People drove with the peculiar impatience that only uncertainty produces. Several vehicles had portable fuel tanks strapped awkwardly to roof racks. One SUV towed a boat despite being hundreds of kilometers from the ocean. Another had bicycles, camping gear, and enough luggage to suggest its owners had packed first and decided where they were going later. Canmore looked less like a town preparing for disaster than one trying very hard to pretend nothing unusual was happening. The grocery store parking lot, however, betrayed the truth. Every shopping cart had disappeared into the building. People hurried in with determined expressions and emerged with bottled water, canned food, propane cylinders, pet supplies, diapers, flour, and anything else that represented certainty in physical form. Shelves emptied, not because everyone expected immediate collapse, but because each person believed someone else might. Civilization is surprisingly fragile that way. It rests upon the assumption that tomorrow's shelves will resemble today's. Remove that assumption, and ordinary mathematics becomes human behavior. Inside the hardware store, where I was better known than at the grocery store, I found Gary behind the counter trying unsuccessfully to answer 3 ringing telephones while helping a line of customers that stretched halfway down the plumbing aisle. Gary had sold me everything from pressure-treated lumber to stainless steel bolts over the past 20 years. He looked exhausted already. "You hear anything?" I asked, after finally reaching the register. He gave a short laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. "I've heard everything. I was hoping for something true." "Me too." He leaned closer before lowering his voice. "My supplier in Calgary called an hour ago, said to order whatever I think I'll need for the next 6 months. "Did he say why?" "He just said transportation is becoming uncertain." "That's not an engineering term." "No," Gary replied quietly. "It's not." I bought hydraulic oil, water filters, chainsaw files, batteries, and enough fasteners to repair nearly anything likely to fail around the property. None of it was urgent. All of it suddenly felt essential. As Gary scanned the items, the overhead television switched from local programming to a live international news conference. Every conversation in the store stopped almost simultaneously. A woman wearing the insignia of an international astronomical consortium stepped to the podium. She looked as though she had not slept in a very long time. "Our observations," she began carefully, "confirm that the lunar orbit has experienced a measurable alteration." No one in the hardware store moved. "We are continuing to refine our models. While significant uncertainties remain, current data indicate the moon's average orbital distance is increasing." Someone near the paint department whispered a curse. The scientist continued speaking, but my attention drifted to the expressions around me. These were practical people, contractors, farmers, mechanics, retirees, men and women accustomed to solving tangible problems with tools they could hold in their hands. Yet every face carried the same expression I felt inside myself. We had all suddenly become passengers. The drive home took nearly twice as long because fuel stations along the highway were already backed up onto the road. Several pumps had plastic bags taped over their nozzles. Whether they had run dry or simply lost electronic payment systems, I couldn't tell. At one intersection, I watched 2 drivers step from their vehicles and begin shouting over who had entered first. Less than 24 hours earlier, they would probably have apologized to each other. Now they behaved like competitors rather than neighbors. By late afternoon, the wind arrived. Not a storm, not even particularly strong, just wrong. It came from a direction I had never experienced during this season, warm when it should have been cold, carrying the faint smell of damp earth instead of alpine frost. My weather station confirmed what my skin already suspected. Barometric pressure had begun oscillating in short, irregular pulses, unlike any normal weather pattern I had recorded over 6 years. Temperature rose nearly 7 degrees in less than 40 minutes before falling again just as quickly. I recalibrated every sensor. Then I recalibrated them a second time. The instruments agreed with one another. That frightened me more than if they had failed. As evening settled over the valley, I climbed the rocky outcrop above my property, where I usually watched meteor showers each August. The sky was perfectly clear. The stars emerged one by one with impossible sharpness. For several minutes I simply stood there listening to my own breathing. Then I realized what had been bothering me all day. The darkness itself felt different, not darker, deeper. The familiar geometry of moonlight, the subtle silver wash that softened every mountain ridge and forest clearing even before moonrise, was absent. It was as though the night had gained a new dimension, one I had never noticed, because the moon had always quietly filled it. When the moon finally appeared above the eastern peaks, it took me several seconds to understand why my stomach tightened. It looked smaller, not dramatically, not enough for anyone casually glancing upward after dinner. But I had spent thousands of nights under that sky. Engineers measure without rulers. We compare, we remember, we notice. I raised my binoculars with hands that suddenly felt very old. The scar along the lunar surface remained visible, but now, beside it, something else caught the sunlight. A faint stream of glittering debris continued to trail silently behind the moon, stretching across space like the tail of a departing comet. And for the first time since the impact, I no longer wondered whether the moon was leaving us. I wondered what might still be following it. The third morning began with a mistake that nearly cost me my life, although I did not realize it until much later. I had become so focused on the sky that I stopped paying proper attention to the ground beneath my own boots. Engineers have a dangerous habit of chasing the largest problem in the room, while assuming the smaller systems will continue behaving as expected. That assumption had served me well for 40 years in factories and power plants, because the smaller systems were usually designed by competent people who followed standards, inspection schedules, and maintenance intervals. Nature had signed no such agreement. I was halfway down the trail toward the creek to inspect the hydro intake, when the familiar footbridge shifted beneath me with a sharp wooden crack that I had never heard before. Instinct threw me backward before conscious thought arrived. A support timber snapped free and disappeared into the rushing water below, vanishing so quickly that for a moment I questioned whether it had ever existed at all. I stood there with my heart pounding against my ribs, staring at a bridge I had crossed hundreds of times without hesitation. The remaining structure leaned at an angle that should not have been possible. Frost had not damaged it. Rot had not weakened it. I knew every board in that bridge because I had built it myself. Something else had changed. I climbed carefully down the bank and crouched beside the creek. The water had always been predictable. Spring runoff brought violence. Late summer brought calm. Autumn settled into a comfortable rhythm that varied only with rainfall. Now the current surged in strange, irregular pulses, as though an invisible hand kept squeezing the valley from somewhere beyond the mountains. Every few minutes the water rose several centimeters against the rocks before settling again. Then it repeated the cycle with no obvious pattern. I took out a folding ruler from my jacket pocket, wedged it into the gravel, and watched the fluctuations for nearly 20 minutes. They were real, small, certainly, but unmistakable. Water does not lie. I filled a notebook page with measurements, times, temperatures, and observations, while trying to convince myself there must be some upstream explanation, a temporary ice jam perhaps, or a beaver dam giving way. Yet even as I wrote those possibilities down, I crossed them out one by one. None of them fit. The creek behaved less like a mountain stream and more like a tide pool trying to remember instructions that no longer existed. Back at the house, I spread maps, astronomical tables, and engineering pads across the dining room table until it resembled the temporary command center of someone preparing for an impossible examination. My retirement had left me with far too many books that normal people would never own. Fluid dynamics, structural vibration, orbital mechanics from a university course I had taken out of curiosity 30 years earlier. None of them offered a chapter entitled "What Happens When the Moon Leaves." The equations described stable systems, not broken ones. Every calculation depended on constants that humanity had treated as permanent, simply because they had remained unchanged for longer than civilization itself. I found myself laughing quietly at the absurdity of it. We had built our sciences on the assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. That assumption had served us remarkably well for several thousand years. Apparently, it had expired sometime around 3:17 on Tuesday afternoon. The radio offered little comfort. Government announcements had become more frequent but less informative, a sure sign that those making the announcements understood less than those listening to them hoped. Emergency management agencies urged calm while simultaneously requesting municipalities to conserve fuel, inspect water treatment facilities, and prepare contingency plans for interruptions to transportation and electrical infrastructure. They never explained why. They didn't have to. Between the lines, a careful listener could hear institutions improvising in real time. The phrase, "out of an abundance of caution," appeared so often that it began sounding like a confession. Every few minutes, another amateur operator broke into the emergency frequencies, with stories dismissed as exaggerations, until identical reports arrived from hundreds of kilometers away. Commercial fishing boats described currents behaving unpredictably. Observatory staff reported that tracking software required constant recalibration. Farmers in Saskatchewan claimed their livestock had refused to leave their barns despite clear weather. One rancher swore that every horse on his property had turned east simultaneously during the previous night and remained motionless for nearly an hour, ears forward, staring toward the horizon. I dismissed that story immediately. Then I remembered the silence in my own valley. By late morning, I decided to drive farther west toward one of the alpine lakes I often visited during retirement. The road climbed steadily through dense stands of spruce before opening onto broad views of the surrounding peaks. But something about the landscape resisted familiarity. At first, I blamed the tension that had settled into my own mind. Fear changes perception long before it changes reality. Yet the farther I drove, the more I noticed subtle irregularities that refused to leave me alone. A hillside normally busy with grazing mountain goats stood completely empty. A marsh where trumpeter swans gathered every autumn reflected only still water and reeds. Even the insects seemed absent. I rolled down the truck window. Nothing, no buzzing, no bird song, only the tires humming against the pavement and the low growl of the diesel engine. It was the quiet that unsettled me most. Every ecosystem carries a background conversation, countless small voices overlapping into what we casually call nature. Someone had lowered the volume. The lake itself should have reassured me. It had always been one of the most beautiful places I knew, a long sheet of blue water framed by snow-dusted peaks and dark evergreen forest. Instead, I stopped breathing for several seconds after stepping out of the truck. The shoreline looked wrong. Not dramatically, not enough for a tourist to notice. But I had fished there for nearly 20 years. I knew where certain boulders disappeared beneath the surface every October. I knew which fallen log floated free each spring before drifting back against the same point of shore. Today, those landmarks sat exposed several meters farther from the water than they should have. The lake had fallen. There had been no drought, no dam, no diversion project. I walked to the edge and crouched beside the wet stones, noticing a fresh line of stranded algae marking where the water had rested only a day or two earlier. The surface itself remained oddly restless, despite the absence of wind. Gentle waves crossed one another from different directions, creating shifting diamond patterns that belonged more to the open ocean than to an isolated mountain lake. I reached into the water. It felt colder than it should have, though perhaps that was my imagination. I hoped it was my imagination. An engineer learns to distrust coincidences, but he also learns to distrust himself when enough impossible observations begin accumulating. The mind desperately wants patterns, even where none exist. As I stood there, movement caught the corner of my eye. A bull elk emerged silently from the trees. He was magnificent, his antlers broad and heavy, his coat thickening for winter. Under ordinary circumstances, he would have ignored me or retreated cautiously into the forest. Instead, he walked to the shoreline, stopped, and stared across the lake without acknowledging my existence. His ears twitched only once. Every muscle remained perfectly still. Another elk joined him, then a third. Within minutes, perhaps 20 animals had gathered along the shoreline in complete silence, all facing exactly the same direction, east, toward the place where the moon would eventually rise. I spoke aloud without meaning to. "What do you know?" None of them reacted. For nearly 10 minutes they remained frozen like statues carved from autumn itself. Then, without warning, every animal wheeled simultaneously and vanished into the trees with astonishing speed, leaving only the sound of branches snapping somewhere deep within the forest. I was suddenly aware that I was alone, truly alone. The realization settled over me with surprising force. It had nothing to do with the absence of people. I had chosen solitude years ago and had never regretted it. This was something older, more instinctive. For the first time in my life, I felt as though humanity had somehow slipped out of synchronization with the natural world. The animals were still receiving instructions. We weren't. I hurried back toward the truck much faster than dignity required. Halfway there, the satellite emergency alert system on my phone activated despite having shown no signal for most of the morning. A shrill tone echoed through the valley before text appeared across the screen. National Emergency Bulletin. All coastal regions are under mandatory evacuation orders. I frowned. Coastal evacuation? Across every ocean? That made no sense. I opened the full bulletin. The download stalled twice before completing. My eyes moved directly to the final paragraph. Updated orbital observations indicate the rate of lunar recession has increased beyond previous projections. Revised tidal models are no longer considered reliable. Citizens are advised to avoid speculation and await further official guidance. No longer considered reliable. I read the sentence again. Not inaccurate, not under revision. No longer reliable. The people with the world's most sophisticated computers had effectively admitted they no longer knew what the oceans were going to do. I looked across the lake once more. The strange crossing waves continued without wind. The exposed shoreline stretched farther than memory insisted it should. Above the eastern mountains, hidden for now beyond daylight, the moon continued its silent retreat. And somewhere beyond it, invisible against the blackness of space, something glittered in pursuit. By the fourth day, I found myself thinking less about the moon and more about the earth itself. It was an odd shift, one that arrived quietly while I was standing in the utility room watching the inverter cycle electricity from the batteries to the house. The display glowed its usual reassuring green, reporting voltages, amperage, charge percentages, and frequencies with the unemotional precision I had spent an entire career trusting. The system was functioning exactly as designed, yet I realized that every number on that screen depended upon assumptions that extended far beyond copper wires and lithium cells. Reliable solar production assumed predictable daylight. Predictable daylight assumed a stable planet. A stable planet assumed orbital mechanics that had remained essentially unchanged since long before the first human being struck two stones together to make fire. The inverter had no idea the universe had changed. It simply continued converting electricity according to immutable physical laws, while the much larger machine surrounding it had begun drifting toward unknown territory. I found myself envying that little box of electronics. It had no imagination. It could not worry about tomorrow. The weather station delivered its first unmistakable warning shortly after breakfast. My instrument sampled conditions every minute, storing years of data that I occasionally graphed simply because retirement had left me with more curiosity than deadlines. The overnight temperature curve looked wrong. Not merely unusual, wrong. Instead of cooling steadily until sunrise, the temperature had oscillated several times, climbing and falling in irregular pulses that resembled the output of a malfunctioning thermostat. Barometric pressure wandered aimlessly instead of following the broad, graceful trends associated with approaching weather systems. Even the wind direction had spun through nearly a full circle during the night, despite average speeds barely exceeding 10 kilometers per hour. I recalibrated every sensor for the third time in 4 days. They agreed with one another as faithfully as ever. It wasn't the instruments that had become unreliable. It was the atmosphere. I carried my notebook onto the deck and compared this week's observations with records from the previous 5 Octobers. The differences leapt off the page. Engineers rarely need advanced statistics to recognize a failing system. Patterns reveal themselves long before mathematics confirms them. Every graph that should have looked familiar had acquired subtle distortions, tiny deviations that by themselves meant almost nothing, but together formed the unmistakable signature of a machine operating outside its design envelope. It reminded me of diagnosing worn turbines years earlier. One vibration sensor might show only a slight increase. Another would detect a barely measurable harmonic. Bearing temperatures might rise half a degree. None of those indicators justified shutting down a $1 million machine. All of them together told an experienced engineer that something deep inside the system had begun moving where it should not. The earth was beginning to vibrate. The radio was busier than I had ever heard it. Emergency frequencies had become crowded with voices that no longer bothered pretending everything was under control. Utility companies reported widespread synchronization problems across sections of the electrical grid. Hydroelectric operators were observing river flow variations that defied seasonal forecasts. Airline dispatchers discussed revised navigation procedures after several commercial flights experienced unexplained discrepancies between inertial navigation systems and satellite positioning. One transmission caught my attention immediately. A geophysicist somewhere in British Columbia calmly explained that sensitive instruments had detected slight but measurable changes in stresses along several major fault systems. The interviewer asked whether earthquakes were imminent. The scientist hesitated long enough for every listener to hear the uncertainty before answering that no direct connection had yet been established. I recognized the language. It was the vocabulary of professionals attempting to remain scientifically honest while privately hoping their worst suspicions were wrong. I decided to hike to the ridge above the valley where I had installed a small weather camera years earlier. The camera transmitted photographs every hour to my home server, creating time-lapse videos of changing seasons that I occasionally watched during long winter evenings. It seemed like a good excuse to inspect the solar panel powering it and perhaps clear away any snow. The climb usually took 45 minutes at an easy pace. This morning it took nearly an hour because I kept stopping to look around. Not out of fear exactly, but because the mountains themselves seemed subtly unfamiliar. Shadows lingered where I did not remember seeing them. Light reflected from distant cliffs at angles that my memory quietly insisted were impossible for this time of year. More than once I blamed fatigue. More than once I checked my compass to reassure myself I had not somehow wandered onto a different trail. North remained north, south remained south. Yet the landscape refused to settle comfortably into the mental map I had built over 2 decades. When I reached the camera mast, I immediately noticed the first physical damage. The steel pole leaned perhaps 3 degrees farther west than when I had installed it. I knew because I had surveyed the site myself, poured the concrete footing, and measured the vertical alignment twice before tightening the final bolts. Concrete does not simply tilt in solid bedrock. Kneeling beside the foundation, I discovered a hairline crack running through the surrounding granite, fresh enough that pale rock still showed beneath its weathered surface. I placed my fingertips against it. It was barely wide enough to admit a credit card, yet it continued several meters across the ridge before disappearing beneath moss. I had walked past that spot dozens of times. The crack had not existed. The camera itself was functioning. I opened the previous 48 hours of images on my tablet and began scrolling through them. At first, everything appeared normal. Clouds drifted. Shadows moved. A pair of deer crossed the meadow below on the previous afternoon. Then I noticed something in the nighttime frames. Every image showed the stars shifting as expected with Earth's rotation, but the moon's position advanced slightly farther than the astronomical software predicted, only a fraction of a degree each hour, barely perceptible to the naked eye. Yet over the course of the night, the discrepancy accumulated until it became impossible to dismiss. The automated timestamp overlaid on each image remained correct. The stars behaved normally. Only the moon refused to occupy the place the software expected it to be. I enlarged the final image taken before dawn. For a long moment I simply stared. The debris trailing behind the moon had grown longer, much longer. It no longer resembled a faint cloud of dust. Instead, it stretched across the darkness in a thin silver ribbon that caught sunlight even while much of the moon remained in shadow. It looked disturbingly organic, like the luminous trail left behind by some deep-sea creature swimming through black water. My rational mind immediately supplied explanations involving dust particles, varying orbital velocities, and changing illumination angles. None of those explanations quieted the primitive part of my brain that had already reached its own conclusion. The moon was not merely moving, it was escaping. The hike back down should have calmed me. Physical work usually did. Instead, I became increasingly aware that the forest was beginning to awaken, but not in the reassuring way I expected. Birds had returned, though only in scattered numbers, and their calls sounded oddly hesitant, as though each note waited for permission before the next followed. A red squirrel darted across the trail carrying an entire pine cone instead of stripping it in place. Even the wind had acquired a restless quality, arriving in short bursts from conflicting directions before dying away completely. Every living thing appeared to be adapting to instructions that humanity had not yet received. That evening, shortly before sunset, I climbed onto the roof to inspect the solar array after noticing an unexplained reduction in charging efficiency. The panels were perfectly clean, no snow, no leaves, no damage. While checking the mounting brackets, I glanced toward the western horizon. The sun stopped me cold. It was setting exactly where it should. At least, almost. I fetched a small brass sighting compass from my workshop and aligned it against a permanent reference mark I had carved into the deck railing years earlier while calibrating another project. I repeated the measurement 3 times. The result differed by less than half a degree. A trivial amount. Small enough to dismiss. Small enough to terrify an engineer. Because I knew that reference mark had not moved, neither had I. Standing on my roof in the cooling mountain air, surrounded by peaks that had survived glaciers, earthquakes, and 10,000 winters, I felt something I had never experienced before. Not fear of dying, not fear of starvation, not even fear of civilization collapsing. I felt fear that the coordinate system by which I had unconsciously organized my entire life was beginning to drift. When darkness finally settled over the valley, I waited for the moon. It rose later than expected. It appeared smaller again, and through my spotting scope, with the magnification turned almost to its limit, I saw something that no government bulletin, no observatory report, and no scientist on the radio had yet mentioned. The moon was no longer perfectly round. One edge had become ever so slightly flattened. I lowered the eyepiece, blinked several times, and looked again. The shape remained, not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. Enough to understand that whatever forces had struck the moon had not finished with it. And perhaps they had not finished with us either. The 5th morning began with the sound of breaking glass, although when I reached the kitchen, I discovered that nothing had actually broken. The sound had come from somewhere outside the house, sharp enough to wake me instantly, followed by a low, groaning vibration that seemed to pass beneath the floor rather than through the air. I stood barefoot in the hallway for several seconds, every instinct insisting that something enormous had just happened, while every visible object around me remained exactly where it belonged. The grandfather clock continued its steady pendulum swing. The wood stove radiated the comfortable warmth I had banked before bed. The refrigerator hummed quietly on inverter power. Even the coffee grinder, sitting where I had left it the previous evening, seemed almost offended by my sudden suspicion of ordinary things. After spending an entire career solving mechanical problems, I had learned that the most dangerous failures often announce themselves with a single unfamiliar sound long before they become visible. Somewhere, some component had just complained. The difficulty lay in discovering whether that component belonged to my house or to the planet beneath it. I stepped onto the deck carrying nothing more than a flashlight and a mug of coffee that immediately began steaming into the cold mountain air. Dawn had not yet reached the valley floor. The eastern peaks were only beginning to separate themselves from the darkness when another deep vibration rolled through the mountains. This one lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was too smooth to resemble an earthquake and too broad to resemble an explosion. Instead, it felt strangely elastic, as though the ground had flexed almost imperceptibly before settling back into place. The coffee inside my mug developed perfectly concentric ripples that continued long after the vibration itself had faded. I set the mug on the railing and watched them slowly disappear. Somewhere deep inside me, a memory surfaced from decades earlier when I had assisted in vibration testing on a large hydroelectric turbine. The engineers had deliberately driven the machine through a range of resonant frequencies, while hundreds of sensors recorded how the surrounding structure responded. Nothing had broken that day because we understood exactly what frequencies we were introducing. Standing on my deck, watching circles spread across cooling coffee, I found myself wondering an absurd question. What happens when the Earth encounters a resonance no one has ever measured before? The answer, at least initially, seemed to involve water. I hiked down to the creek carrying a laser rangefinder, a survey rod, and enough equipment to convince myself that collecting data was somehow more productive than worrying. Overnight, I had driven 2 steel stakes into opposite banks and stretched a reference line between them. Now I measured the water level every 5 minutes while recording the time to the second. Within half an hour, the pattern became undeniable. The creek no longer flowed at a nearly constant depth. Instead, it rose and fell in gentle oscillations, averaging 6 to 8 centimeters, repeating at intervals that varied between 14 and 19 minutes. Mountain streams simply do not behave that way. There were no dams upstream, no hydroelectric releases, no rainfall, no melting snowpack significant enough to produce rhythmic surges. Yet there they were, arriving one after another with quiet determination, each pulse lifting driftwood against the banks before releasing it again. It reminded me less of a river than of an enormous animal breathing in its sleep. I carried my notebook back to the house and overlaid my observations with the latest emergency broadcasts I had copied from the radio. Reports from around the world painted a picture so fragmented that it almost resisted interpretation. Harbors in parts of the Atlantic were experiencing unpredictable water level fluctuations despite calm weather. Inland lakes in Scandinavia were reportedly developing standing waves that persisted for hours. River pilots on the Mississippi complained that current velocities were changing faster than navigation charts could accommodate. Individually, each report sounded exaggerated. Together they formed the outline of something I desperately hoped I was imagining. The moon had not simply controlled tides. It had been applying a steady, familiar gravitational rhythm to an entire planet for billions of years. Remove that rhythm, and perhaps the oceans did not merely become untidy. Perhaps they began searching for a new equilibrium they could not easily find. Just after noon, the emergency satellite channel briefly returned, long enough to deliver the first truly alarming scientific briefing. The speaker was an orbital dynamicist from an observatory whose name I missed because the transmission began midway through his sentence. His voice remained remarkably calm, but beneath that calm I heard exhaustion, the kind earned only after several days of calculations that refused to produce comforting answers. The moon, he explained, was continuing to accelerate away from Earth at a rate inconsistent with initial impact models. Several independent observatories had confirmed the measurements. They were no longer debating whether the recession was occurring. They were debating why it was accelerating. He emphasized repeatedly that no known mechanism adequately explained the observed increase. That sentence lodged itself in my thoughts with uncomfortable permanence. Engineers dislike unexplained acceleration. Machines rarely increase speed without an additional force acting upon them. Momentum carries things forward. Acceleration requires something to keep pushing. I spent the afternoon checking every bolt, hinge, cable, and support beam around the property, partly because maintenance always steadied my nerves, and partly because familiar work created the illusion of control. I tightened loose brackets on the solar array, serviced the backup generator, inspected the propane regulator, and sharpened 2 chainsaw chains I did not immediately need. The repetitive motions allowed my mind to wander through possibilities I wished it would abandon. Could debris from the impact be acting like tiny thrusters as volatile materials escaped into space? Unlikely. Could solar radiation pressure somehow be amplified by the expanding cloud surrounding the moon? Not enough. Every explanation I constructed collapsed beneath its own arithmetic. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain the acceleration and settled for documenting it. Data first, conclusions later. That principle had rescued more than one engineering project during my career. Late that afternoon, I noticed the deer. 5 of them emerged from the forest beyond the meadow and walked slowly toward the creek. They drank only briefly before lifting their heads almost simultaneously. Instead of feeding, they turned toward the eastern sky, remaining perfectly motionless for nearly a minute. Then, without any visible threat, they bolted uphill with astonishing urgency, disappearing into dense timber where I rarely saw deer travel. 10 minutes later, the vibration returned, stronger than before. Windows rattled softly inside the house. The wind chimes hanging beneath the porch roof rang only once, despite the complete absence of wind. I wrote the time beside the earlier wildlife observations. I had no evidence whatsoever that the 2 events were connected. I could not shake the feeling that they were. As darkness approached, I climbed once again to the rocky overlook above my cabin, carrying the spotting scope and a folding chair. The air was unusually clear, the Milky Way beginning to emerge with breathtaking brilliance overhead. In another lifetime, I would have described the evening as perfect. Now beauty itself had become unsettling because it continued existing alongside mounting evidence that the world was quietly unraveling. I found the moon almost immediately. It had changed again. The flattening I had noticed the previous evening remained visible, though only barely. More disturbing was the debris stream. It no longer resembled a simple trail of dust. Through the eyepiece it appeared structured, almost braided, with brighter knots embedded within the faint silver ribbon extending into darkness. My first thought was that sunlight was catching larger fragments differently than smaller ones. My second thought arrived before I could prevent it. Those brighter points seemed to be moving independently. I leaned closer to the eyepiece until my forehead pressed against the rubber cup. Atmospheric turbulence shimmered across the image, making certainty impossible. I forced myself to step back, breathe slowly, and remind myself that exhausted minds manufacture patterns from insufficient evidence. I had spent enough years around precision instruments to know how easily optical illusions arise at extreme magnification. Then one of the bright points abruptly changed direction, only slightly, only for an instant, but enough to send a chill through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I looked away from the scope and stared upward with my naked eyes. The moon appeared serene, distant, almost unchanged to anyone who had not spent decades beneath these same skies. Somewhere beyond those pale, familiar craters, the laws that had governed Earth for billions of years were being rewritten, one equation at a time. The radio clipped to my belt suddenly crackled to life. To all amateur operators, static. Any optical observations of unidentified objects near the lunar debris field, more static. Repeat. Unidentified. The transmission dissolved into hissing noise before the sentence finished. I slowly lowered the radio. Then I looked back through the spotting scope. The bright point I had been watching was gone, but another had appeared, closer to the moon than before. By the 6th day, I had stopped asking whether my observations were real and had begun asking a far more dangerous question, whether I was observing enough. There is a peculiar comfort in engineering because every problem begins with measurement. Before replacing a bearing, you measure vibration. Before repairing a beam, you measure deflection. Before redesigning a pump, you measure flow. The measurements may reveal terrible news, but at least they establish a common reality. Everyone involved is standing on the same floor. That morning, I realized the floor itself had become uncertain. Every instrument in my house still functioned flawlessly. My thermometer agreed with my weather station. My compass agreed with my survey bearings. My clocks remained synchronized by their internal oscillators after I deliberately disconnected every external signal. The instruments hadn't failed. Reality had become more complicated than the assumptions built into them. I decided that if the world insisted on changing, I would force it to leave a record. After breakfast, I transformed my workshop into something resembling a small observatory. I mounted an old DSLR camera onto the spotting scope using an adapter I had machined years earlier for photographing wildlife. I built a simple tracking platform from spare aluminum extrusion and stepper motors left over from a woodworking project. It wasn't elegant, but elegance had never interested me nearly as much as repeatability. By noon, I had programmed the camera to photograph the moon every 3 minutes from moonrise until dawn. Along the outside wall of the workshop, I bolted a stainless steel measuring rod permanently into the bedrock, establishing what surveyors call a benchmark, a point assumed not to move. It occurred to me, halfway through drilling the anchor holes, that I was placing extraordinary faith in the stability of Canadian granite at precisely the moment the planet appeared intent on abandoning stability altogether. The radio offered only fragments of a much larger conversation. International space agencies had apparently stopped publishing detailed orbital updates, releasing only carefully worded summaries instead. Officially, this was to prevent the spread of misinformation. Unofficially, judging from the increasingly frustrated voices on amateur frequencies, many believed the calculations themselves had become too uncertain to publish with confidence. Scientists dislike saying we don't know. Governments dislike it even more. Yet scattered among the static were enough clues to paint an unsettling picture. Lunar laser ranging stations, the facilities that bounced lasers off reflectors left on the moon decades earlier, were reporting inconsistent return times. Some operators blamed atmospheric interference. Others quietly suggested that the reflectors themselves were no longer where the models expected them to be. One exhausted astronomer remarked that they were recalibrating software faster than they could trust it. I understood exactly what he meant. When reality begins outrunning your equations, every correction feels temporary. Around mid-afternoon, I drove to a high meadow nearly 15 kilometers from the cabin where the horizon opened in every direction. The route wound through forests that had become strangely empty. Several times I slowed the truck, convinced I had seen movement between the trees, only to discover nothing there except shafts of sunlight cutting through the branches. Once, I stopped entirely because the silence had become so complete that I could hear individual pine needles falling onto the forest floor. That should have been impossible. Wind masks small sounds. Birds mask them. Streams mask them. Remove enough layers of familiar noise, and the world becomes acoustically enormous. Every footstep echoed just a little farther than memory insisted it should. The meadow overlooked a small glacial lake tucked between rounded hills. I had visited it dozens of times over the years, often bringing lunch and a folding chair simply to enjoy the view. Today the lake looked uneasy. Gentle ripples crossed its surface from 3 different directions simultaneously, despite the air remaining almost perfectly still. They intersected, canceled one another, reappeared, then traveled outward again in patterns too orderly to be random and too irregular to be explained by ordinary wind. I unpacked a digital level from the truck, placed it across a flat rock near the shoreline, and watched a tiny bubble remain stubbornly centered. The ground itself hadn't tilted, yet the water behaved as though invisible fingers continued touching it from below. I found myself thinking about resonance again. Every physical system possesses natural frequencies: bridges, buildings, turbines, aircraft wings. Push them gently at exactly the right interval, and surprisingly little force can produce catastrophic motion. We teach engineering students famous examples: soldiers breaking step while crossing bridges, wind collapsing suspension spans, engines vibrating themselves apart. But what if the Earth possessed resonances humanity had never needed to understand, because the moon had quietly damped them for billions of years? The thought sounded almost absurd, and yet absurdity had become an increasingly poor filter for rejecting possibilities. Returning home near sunset, I noticed something that made me pull onto the shoulder so abruptly the truck skidded on loose gravel. A roadside sign, one I had passed hundreds of times, cast its shadow several centimeters farther north than I expected. I stared at it long enough to question my own memory before retrieving a small notebook from the glove compartment. Years earlier, while experimenting with a homemade solar tracker, I had recorded shadow angles from that exact turnout because it offered an unobstructed western horizon. The old measurements were still there in faded pencil. I repeated them twice using the same improvised method. The difference amounted to less than 1 degree, tiny, almost laughably small, yet far too large to ignore. I sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes without starting the engine. Perhaps the atmosphere was refracting sunlight differently. Perhaps my procedure introduced error. Perhaps fatigue had finally begun affecting my judgment. Engineers survive by doubting themselves before doubting physics. When I reached the cabin, I carried the notebook inside and deliberately placed it beside 3 others filled with observations from the previous 5 days. I resisted every temptation to connect the dots. Raw data first, interpretation later. That discipline had saved expensive projects during my working life. It did not save my peace of mind. Moonrise came beneath an exceptionally clear sky. The automated camera clicked softly every 3 minutes while I watched through the spotting scope, making only occasional adjustments to keep the lunar disk centered. The scar from the impact had become unmistakable now, a broad region of fractured terrain reflecting sunlight differently from the surrounding surface. The trailing ribbon of debris stretched farther than ever, fading gradually into darkness until it disappeared beyond the limits of the telescope's field of view. Then something happened that no optical illusion could explain. A pinpoint of light detached itself from the debris stream. It did not streak away like a meteor. It did not tumble randomly like a fragment of rock. It drifted, slowly, deliberately, across the blackness beside the moon. I lowered the eyepiece immediately and checked the camera feed. The point appeared there as well. 3 minutes later, another photograph captured it in a different position. Another 3 minutes. Another position. The movement was subtle, measurable only because the automated system had removed my own eyes from the equation. I calculated the apparent angular displacement twice before forcing myself to stop. At that distance, apparent motion alone revealed almost nothing about actual velocity, unless it was close to the moon. My pulse had become loud enough that I could hear it over the faint ticking of the camera shutter. The radio on my workbench crackled. Multiple observatories. Static. Confirming transient luminous objects. More static. Repeat. Not associated with known debris trajectories. The transmission vanished into noise. I looked back through the spotting scope. There was no longer one moving light. There were four. They were faint. They were tiny. They were almost certainly natural. I repeated that last thought several times, not because I believed it completely, but because I desperately wanted to. Outside, the forest remained silent. Inside, the camera continued taking photographs every 3 minutes, preserving evidence that I suspected the world would soon argue about for generations. And for the first time since the asteroid struck, I caught myself hoping that every strange thing I had seen could somehow be explained by ordinary physics. Because if ordinary physics was no longer enough, then whatever was happening around the moon had only just begun. I stopped measuring time by dates sometime during the 7th day. Calendars suddenly seemed like artifacts from a civilization that believed tomorrow would resemble today, and I no longer possessed that confidence. Instead, I began organizing my thoughts by observations. The day of the first oscillating creek, the day the elk stared east, the day the moon became visibly smaller, the day the moving lights appeared. Engineers have an unfortunate tendency to catalog reality even when reality has ceased cooperating, and perhaps that impulse was the only thing preserving my sanity. Every notebook on my dining room table represented a promise I had made to myself: observe first, conclude later. Yet the gap between those two steps was narrowing. The evidence was accumulating faster than my ability to explain it. The overnight camera sequence had captured nearly 200 photographs, and I spent the morning assembling them into a time-lapse. I expected to confirm what I had already seen through the spotting scope, that several faint luminous points were drifting near the moon. Instead, I discovered something far stranger. When viewed individually, each image appeared ordinary. When played in sequence, however, the points did not move independently. They moved in relation to one another. Their paths curved gently, diverged, converged, then separated again in ways that reminded me less of random debris and more of iron filings responding to an invisible magnetic field. I immediately distrusted the conclusion. Cameras introduce artifacts. Compression creates patterns where none exist. Atmospheric turbulence distorts position from frame to frame. I spent nearly 2 hours trying to prove the sequence meaningless before reluctantly admitting that my own counter-arguments failed. Whatever those lights represented, they were not behaving the way every orbital mechanics textbook on my shelves insisted they should. The radio provided little opportunity to dwell on the mystery. The practical consequences of the moon's retreat had begun arriving faster than the scientific explanations. Fuel rationing was being introduced throughout several provinces. Commercial flights across large sections of North America had been reduced dramatically while navigation systems underwent continuous recalibration. Ports on both coasts had suspended normal shipping operations because tidal forecasts had become too unreliable to guarantee safe passage. One fisheries officer from British Columbia described experienced captains refusing to leave harbor after watching currents reverse direction twice within a single afternoon. His voice remained calm, but beneath that calm lay something I recognized immediately. He sounded like a man who had spent his career trusting the ocean and had suddenly discovered the ocean no longer trusted itself. By midday, the electrical grid had returned in parts of Alberta, though only intermittently. I deliberately left my house isolated on battery power. Grid synchronization problems worried me more than temporary outages. Years earlier, I had investigated a generating station where 2 massive alternators had drifted slightly out of phase during a switching event. The resulting mechanical stresses had destroyed equipment worth millions of dollars in less than 10 seconds. Civilization depends upon astonishingly delicate agreements. Every power station must produce electricity at precisely the same frequency. Every clock must assume time flows uniformly. Every navigation system must agree where north resides. Break enough of those agreements simultaneously, and failures begin appearing in places no one expected. The moon had not simply illuminated our nights. It had quietly participated in the stability of systems humanity scarcely realized were connected. That afternoon, I drove farther into the mountains than I had since retiring, following an old forestry road that climbed toward a fire lookout abandoned decades earlier. I wanted elevation. More importantly, I wanted distance from the increasingly anxious conversations filtering through the radio. Machines never became offended by uncomfortable questions. Mountains never held press conferences. If answers existed, perhaps they would reveal themselves where there were fewer human assumptions cluttering the landscape. The lookout still stood, weathered but solid, perched on a granite shoulder overlooking an astonishing sweep of valleys, rivers, and distant peaks fading blue into the horizon. Under ordinary circumstances, the view always reminded me how wonderfully insignificant a single human life really was. Today it produced the opposite sensation. From that height I could see several lakes scattered among the forests, like polished steel mirrors. Every one of them looked restless. Even from kilometers away, I could distinguish strange interference patterns crossing their surfaces. Some lakes displayed long parallel ripples despite the complete absence of wind. Others appeared unnaturally smooth before erupting into expanding rings that vanished almost immediately. Through my binoculars, the largest lake revealed narrow bands of water moving in opposite directions at the same time, as though invisible currents beneath the surface disagreed about where gravity intended them to go. Gravity. The word settled heavily into my thoughts. Perhaps that was the mistake all of us had been making. We kept speaking about tides, weather, navigation, coastlines, and satellites, as though they represented separate problems. Maybe they were merely symptoms. Perhaps the true problem lay deeper, in the countless subtle gravitational relationships that had quietly organized our planet for geological ages. Remove one of the largest nearby masses, and every other balance, however slight, would begin searching for a replacement. Engineers often describe complex systems as settling into new equilibrium after a disturbance. But there was no guarantee the new equilibrium would resemble the old one. I remained at the lookout until sunset, recording observations and listening to the growing silence. Not absolute silence. The wind still whispered through weathered boards. A hawk circled briefly overhead before gliding toward the valley below. Yet something fundamental had changed in the cadence of the wilderness. It no longer felt inhabited in the familiar sense. The mountains seemed to be waiting. The drive home began in darkness. About halfway down the forestry road, my headlights illuminated a herd of bighorn sheep standing directly across the track. There must have been 40 of them, perhaps more. They did not scatter. They did not even appear alarmed by the truck. Instead, they stood shoulder to shoulder, all facing east. Every head angled upward, every eye fixed on the rising moon. I stopped the truck nearly 20 meters away and shut off the engine. The silence that followed felt immense. For almost 5 full minutes, nothing moved. Then, as one animal, the entire herd slowly lowered their heads, not toward the ground, but toward me. It was not aggression, it was not curiosity. It felt evaluative, as though they had only just remembered that humans existed. The irrationality of that thought embarrassed me immediately, yet it refused to leave. I waited another minute before easing the truck into reverse. Only after I had backed nearly 50 meters did the sheep quietly step off the road and disappear into the darkness without a single startled leap or panicked movement. I reached home long after moonrise. The automated camera was still clicking faithfully every 3 minutes. I carried the memory cards inside and began transferring the files while heating a pot of soup I barely tasted. Halfway through the transfer, the software paused unexpectedly. One image had failed verification. Digital files become corrupted occasionally. Power fluctuations, storage errors, cosmic rays. There are always explanations. I opened the damaged frame. Most of the photograph appeared perfectly normal. The moon occupied the upper right corner. The debris stream extended behind it. The stars remained sharp. Across the center of the image, however, stretched a broad, dark band, unlike anything I had seen before. It wasn't noise. It wasn't a scratch. It looked almost as though something immense had briefly passed between my camera and the stars without reflecting enough light to reveal its shape. I frowned and checked the image immediately before it. Nothing unusual. Then the image immediately afterward. Again, perfectly normal. Only one exposure contained the anomaly. 3 minutes later, curiosity overcame skepticism. I enlarged the damaged photograph until individual pixels became visible. Near the edge of the dark band, there were stars, not missing, bent, very slightly, curving around whatever had crossed the field of view. I stared at the screen for so long that the soup on the stove began to boil over behind me. When I finally looked away, my workshop felt suddenly much smaller than it had an hour earlier. Outside, the moon continued its silent retreat. And somewhere between my little cabin in the Canadian Rockies and that wounded, departing world, something had interrupted the starlight. Something my camera had recorded only once. I found myself hoping, with every rational part of my mind, that the image was nothing more than the most extraordinary equipment failure of my life, because the alternative was too large to fit inside any engineering notebook ever written. On the 8th day, I caught myself looking for the moon before I looked for the sun. The realization disturbed me more than I expected. For 69 years, every morning had begun with the practical concerns of weather, daylight, and whatever work lay ahead. Now my first thought was always the same. How much farther? I would step onto the deck with a mug of coffee cooling in my hands and instinctively search the western sky if dawn had not yet erased the stars, or calculate when moonrise would come if daylight had already taken possession of the valley. I had become a man measuring loss one orbit at a time. The irony was impossible to ignore. Engineers spend their lives building things intended to last decades, occasionally centuries, yet all of our bridges, turbines, refineries, pipelines, and factories ultimately depended upon celestial mechanics that we had never built and had therefore taken completely for granted. Civilization had inherited an extraordinarily stable solar system and mistaken that inheritance for permanence. The first indication that the day would be different came from my mechanical clock. Not the digital clocks scattered throughout the house. Those drifted only when power faltered, but the old pendulum regulator that had belonged to my grandfather. I restored it years earlier because I admired its simplicity. Gravity pulled the weights. The pendulum established the rhythm. Brass gears counted the oscillations. Unlike quartz oscillators or atomic clocks, it depended upon nothing more exotic than the steady downward pull of the earth. That morning it had lost nearly 18 seconds overnight. I checked it twice against the battery-powered chronometer I kept in the workshop. Then I adjusted the pendulum length and watched it for another hour. It continued losing time. My first assumption was obvious. Temperature changes alter pendulum length slightly. Moisture affects wooden cases. Wear changes friction. Every one of those explanations had merit until I remembered that I had already compensated for them years ago. The clock had remained within 2 seconds per week ever since. I removed the pendulum, inspected the suspension spring under magnification, cleaned the escapement, reassembled everything, and repeated the test. It still lost time. Not much, barely enough for an ordinary person to notice. Enough for me to understand that one of the oldest methods humanity had ever devised for measuring time was quietly disagreeing with one of the newest. I spent the remainder of the morning building an experiment that, under normal circumstances, would have seemed absurd. In the meadow below the house, I drove a steel rod vertically into the ground and attached a precisely measured crosspiece, creating a simple gnomon, a device older than written history. By recording the shadow's length and direction throughout the day, I hoped to compare the sun's apparent motion against my observations from previous years. The irony wasn't lost on me. Somewhere in the world, supercomputers were undoubtedly processing petabytes of astronomical data while I stood in a mountain meadow with a tape measure, notebook, and sharpen carpenter's pencil. Yet I trusted my little experiment because I understood every source of error. Simplicity is an underrated virtue. Complicated systems fail in complicated ways. A stick casting a shadow has very few opportunities to lie. The radio delivered increasingly fragmented news. Major cities were beginning to experience rolling shortages of food and fuel, not because production had collapsed, but because transportation schedules had become almost impossible to maintain. Ports remained closed along much of the Pacific coast after another series of unpredictable tidal surges had damaged docks and stranded cargo vessels. Rail companies reported unexplained track distortions in several regions. One interview with a structural engineer particularly caught my attention. He described several long-span bridges exhibiting oscillations outside their historical design envelopes, despite moderate weather and ordinary traffic loads. The interviewer repeatedly asked whether the bridges were safe. The engineer answered honestly that they remained structurally sound, but admitted they were behaving in ways their designers had never anticipated. I found myself nodding. The bridges weren't failing. They were adapting to a world that no longer matched the assumptions under which they had been conceived. Around noon, I heard an aircraft. That alone was unusual. Commercial traffic had dwindled dramatically over the previous several days, and the valley had grown almost accustomed to silence overhead. I stepped outside expecting to see an airliner crossing high above the mountains. Instead, 2 military transport aircraft emerged from the south, flying remarkably low, following the contours of the valleys rather than cruising above them. They moved slowly enough that I could distinguish the dark markings beneath their wings. A few moments later, another pair followed the same route. None left contrails. None appeared to be climbing. They vanished behind the western ridges without a sound, other than the steady growl of turboprop engines gradually dissolving into the distance. I had no idea where they were going, but their altitude suggested caution rather than efficiency. Whatever navigation problems the world was experiencing, someone trusted mountain valleys more than open sky. By late afternoon, clouds began gathering over the continental divide, but they behaved strangely. Instead of drifting with the prevailing wind, several formations remained almost stationary, while lower layers moved beneath them in different directions. I retrieved the binoculars and watched one cloud for nearly 15 minutes. Its shape changed as expected, yet its position relative to the mountain peaks remained nearly fixed. It reminded me of smoke trapped beneath an invisible ceiling. Meteorology had never been my specialty, but I knew enough to recognize when the atmosphere was violating its own habits. The animals returned shortly before sunset. This time, they came close. A small pack of wolves emerged silently from the tree line at the far edge of my meadow. There were 6 of them, lean and healthy, their gray coats already thickening against the approaching winter. Under normal circumstances, I would have expected them either to avoid the open field or disappear the moment they detected me. Instead, they stopped perhaps 100 meters away. Every one of them looked toward the eastern horizon, not at me, not at the cabin, at the place where the moon would rise. One by one they sat down. No growling, no pacing, no communication that I could detect. They simply waited. An hour passed. The temperature dropped rapidly, frost forming across the grass as twilight deepened into night. I found myself waiting with them, though I could not have explained why. We had become unwilling participants in the same experiment. Then the moon appeared. A strange murmur escaped the wolves, not a howl, not a bark, but something softer, almost mournful. The sound rose only briefly before fading back into silence. None of the animals looked frightened. They looked bereaved. The word arrived before I could stop it. Bereaved. As though they recognized the departing moon not merely as an object in the sky, but as something that had quietly accompanied every generation of their kind since wolves first learned to hunt beneath its light. The last wolf stood. It looked directly toward my cabin. For several long seconds our eyes met across the meadow. Then the entire pack disappeared into the forest without making enough noise to disturb the frost. I remained outside long after they had gone. The automated telescope had already begun its imaging sequence. Every 3 minutes the camera clicked softly, preserving another fraction of an unfolding catastrophe. Around 10 o'clock I carried the newest images into the workshop. The software aligned each photograph against the previous night's observations. The moon had receded again. The measurement was unmistakable now, no longer fractions of a pixel. No longer something requiring careful statistical analysis. The difference was visible, not dramatic, not yet, but visible. Then another alert appeared on the screen. Reference stars do not match expected positions. I frowned. The telescope software occasionally issued that warning if clouds obscured the sky or the mount slipped slightly. I recalibrated the tracking. Same warning. I selected a different star field. Again, reference stars do not match expected positions. My pulse quickened. The stars themselves hadn't moved. Of course they hadn't. But the software wasn't comparing them to one another. It was comparing them to where the Earth was expected to be while observing them. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, a thought entered my mind that I had carefully avoided. Perhaps it wasn't only the moon that was changing course. I stared at the screen until the next 3-minute exposure completed. The warning disappeared. The reference stars aligned perfectly again, as though nothing had happened. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt something far worse. Whatever had just happened, it had only lasted 3 minutes. And somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond the departing moon and its impossible ribbon of debris, something had briefly altered the geometry of the heavens before quietly letting it return to normal. I closed the observatory roof, locked the workshop, and walked back toward the cabin beneath a sky that no longer felt ancient and dependable. It felt occupied. By the 9th day, I had stopped expecting normality to return. That realization did not arrive with despair, but with a peculiar clarity that I remembered from my engineering career whenever a major piece of equipment crossed the invisible line between repair and replacement. Every experienced engineer knows that moment. You spend hours chasing symptoms, replacing bearings, balancing shafts, recalibrating sensors, tightening fasteners, hoping the next adjustment will restore the machine you once understood. Then, one measurement arrives that quietly ends the discussion. The machine is no longer malfunctioning. It has become something else. Standing at the kitchen window before dawn with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, I finally admitted to myself that I was making the same mistake with the Earth. I kept recording anomalies as though they were temporary deviations from a stable system. They were not. Stability itself had become the anomaly. The sky remained remarkably clear that morning, the kind of crystalline mountain air photographers dream about. The stars lingered longer than usual before yielding to the approaching sunrise, and I found myself studying familiar constellations, not because I expected them to comfort me, but because I wanted reassurance that something in the universe still occupied the place where memory insisted it belonged. Orion climbed exactly where I expected. Cassiopeia rested above the northern trees. Polaris remained fixed with almost stubborn determination. Yet I no longer trusted my own confidence. Every observation now carried an invisible footnote, subject to revision. That phrase had begun appearing in government bulletins with astonishing frequency. Weather forecasts, navigation advisories, shipping schedules, agricultural reports. Everything was provisional. Civilization had become a draft document. The first transmission of the day came from someone I recognized immediately. Professor Alan Mercer from the University of Alberta had occasionally appeared on science programs over the years, explaining astronomy with the rare gift of making difficult ideas sound approachable without making them simplistic. Today he sounded 20 years older than I remembered. The interviewer asked the question millions of people were undoubtedly asking across the world. What exactly are we seeing? There was a long pause before Mercer answered. "We're watching a gravitational system seek a new equilibrium." The interviewer waited. "So, when does it reach one?" Another pause. "We don't know that it does." Silence followed. Not radio silence, human silence. The interviewer eventually thanked him and moved on to another question, but I hardly heard the remainder of the interview. The phrase repeated itself inside my head while I looked across the valley. A new equilibrium. Engineers like equilibrium because equilibrium can be calculated. But some systems never find one. Some systems simply continue changing until they become unrecognizable. I decided to inspect the old railway bridge several kilometers downstream, partly because it offered an excellent vantage point over the river, and partly because bridges reveal truths that landscapes often conceal. Rivers rise and fall, trees sway, clouds drift, steel remembers. If the earth had truly begun changing in subtle ways, perhaps the bridge would already know. The drive took longer than expected because several sections of highway had been reduced to a single lane, while transportation crews investigated unexplained pavement distortions. They were not sinkholes. They were not frost heaves. The asphalt appeared to have developed long, gentle waves, as though the road had briefly softened before hardening again. One foreman stood beside a survey tripod, shaking his head while staring at his instruments. When I reached the bridge, I parked well away from the structure and walked the remaining distance. She had been built sometime in the early 1960s, a graceful steel truss spanning the Bow River, with the quiet confidence of an era that believed infrastructure should outlive politicians. I had always admired it. The rivets were beautifully aligned, the gusset plates oversized by modern standards. Whoever designed her expected decades of heavy freight traffic and intended the bridge to complain long before it failed. Today she was complaining, not visibly, audibly. At first I thought the sound came from the wind. Then I realized there was almost no wind. The bridge emitted a faint, continuous tone just above the threshold of hearing, something between a hum and a distant choir. Every few seconds the pitch shifted slightly before returning again. I rested one hand against the cool steel railing. The vibration was unmistakable, tiny, steady, persistent, not traffic-induced. There were no trains, no trucks, nothing but the river below. I closed my eyes. Every structure possesses natural frequencies. Every engineer learns to respect them. This bridge was vibrating, very gently, as though something enormous beyond human perception continued plucking invisible strings stretched across the continent. I took measurements with the small accelerometer I kept in my field kit. The readings were astonishingly low, almost beneath the instrument's accuracy. Yet they repeated with remarkable consistency. When I looked down at the river, another surprise awaited me. Floating logs no longer traveled in straight lines. They drifted downstream while describing slow, graceful arcs, crossing from one side of the river to the other without any visible eddies to guide them. One particularly long spruce trunk completed nearly half a spiral before continuing downstream again. Water, always water. It seemed to understand before anything else. On the drive home, emergency broadcasts interrupted every station. The federal government announced nationwide fuel conservation measures. Rail traffic would be restricted. Commercial aviation remained limited. Several ports had been closed indefinitely. Power demand would be managed regionally. The language remained calm. The implications did not. Then came something entirely unexpected. The announcement concluded with a request directed specifically toward amateur astronomers. Citizens possessing telescopes, tracking cameras, or astronomical imaging equipment were asked to preserve all observations and refrain from deleting raw image files. No explanation followed. They wanted the data. That meant professional observatories were no longer collecting enough on their own. Or worse, some of them were no longer operating. I reached the cabin shortly before sunset. The automated camera had continued faithfully recording every clear night since I built it. I carried several hard drives from the workshop into the house and began making duplicate copies. One copy remained in the office. Another went into a waterproof container beneath the workshop floor. A third I sealed inside an old ammunition box and buried beneath the woodshed. The action felt strangely theatrical until I reminded myself that engineering records exist for exactly this reason. Future investigators often need yesterday's measurements more than today's opinions. Darkness settled early. The moon rose, smaller again. Its wounded surface remained visible even without the spotting scope. The debris ribbon now stretched so far that my widest field eyepiece could no longer capture its full length. Then the camera shutter clicked. 3 minutes later, it clicked again. Another 3 minutes. Again. Everything appeared routine until the software finished aligning the latest exposure. The screen froze. No warning message appeared. No error code. The alignment algorithm simply stopped. After nearly 30 seconds, a new window opened automatically. It contained a comparison between the newest photograph and the previous night's image. The moon had moved exactly as expected. The stars aligned almost perfectly. The moving lights remained present. But there was something new, far beyond the debris stream, almost at the edge of detectable resolution. A faint object appeared where absolutely nothing had existed the previous evening. It was too dim to identify, too symmetrical to dismiss immediately as noise. I enlarged the image. The object enlarged with it. Not enough to reveal detail. Only enough to confirm that it possessed shape. It was not round, not irregular, not comet-like. It resembled geometry. I leaned closer to the monitor. The software began processing the next exposure automatically. 3 minutes later, the second image appeared. The object had moved. Not much, just enough. Enough that the software highlighted it in yellow. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear blood in my ears. I calculated the apparent angular displacement, almost without thinking. The answer appeared before I finished writing. If the object occupied approximately the same distance as the moon, it was approaching. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Outside, the forest remained utterly silent. Inside, the workshop clock ticked with stubborn mechanical certainty. I looked once more through the spotting scope, but the object remained too faint for my eye alone. Only the camera could see it. Only the mathematics could reveal that, while the moon continued its lonely departure from the earth, something else, something that had not been there only 24 hours earlier, had begun crossing the darkness in the opposite direction, toward us. I have often wondered whether history recognizes the precise moment an age ends, or whether people living through it only understand much later that they have already crossed the boundary. Looking back on my own life, I could identify countless moments that seemed important while they were happening. A graduation, my first engineering job, the day I married, the day I buried my wife, the morning I locked my office for the last time and drove west into the Rockies believing retirement would be measured in fishing trips, coffee on the deck, and quietly fixing things that broke around the property. None of those moments, however, marked the end of an era. They were simply chapters in an ordinary human life. The true dividing line arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when an asteroid struck the far side of the moon. Humanity simply failed to recognize it. We believed we had witnessed an astronomical event. What we had actually witnessed was the removal of one of the oldest assumptions upon which every civilization, every ecosystem, and every human memory had quietly depended. The moon had never merely orbited us. It had accompanied us. It had steadied us. It had pulled gently upon our oceans, our seasons, our nights, and perhaps even our confidence that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. We only discovered how much of our world rested upon that silent partnership after it had already begun slipping away. The following weeks dissolved into a rhythm that no longer resembled ordinary life. Government broadcasts became less frequent, not because the authorities had abandoned their responsibilities, but because certainty itself had become increasingly scarce. International transportation fragmented into regional networks. Coastal populations retreated inland after repeated tidal catastrophes destroyed ports that had operated continuously for generations. Satellite navigation was gradually replaced by terrestrial radio beacons as orbital calculations required constant revision. Weather forecasting became an exercise in probabilities rather than predictions. Farmers planted crops according to experience instead of official guidance. Electrical grids survived only by becoming smaller and more isolated. Great interconnected systems that had once stretched across continents quietly surrendered to local resilience. The irony never escaped me. Humanity had spent 2 centuries building ever larger machines, only to discover that survival belonged to the smaller ones. My own world contracted to the boundaries of the valley. The cabin became less a retirement home than a carefully maintained life support system. Every morning I inspected the batteries, the hydro intake, the solar array, the generator, the propane regulator, and the weather instruments before allowing myself breakfast. The routine became almost liturgical. There was comfort in maintenance. Bolts still tightened according to familiar torque values. Bearings still required lubrication. Filters still clogged. Water still froze at the proper temperature. Not everything had abandoned us. The laws of physics remained astonishingly faithful. It was only the larger choreography of the heavens that had changed. The moon continued shrinking, not dramatically, not from one day to the next, but month after month. There could no longer be any argument. The great familiar disk that had illuminated every human civilization became a brilliant coin suspended in darkness, then a bright marble. Eventually, even to the naked eye, it lost the quiet authority it had possessed throughout recorded history. Children born after the catastrophe would grow up believing the moon had always been small. Only those of us who remembered would carry the strange grief of realizing that the night itself had once been brighter. The animals adapted before we did. That remained one of the most remarkable observations in all my notebooks. Migration routes shifted. Wolves altered hunting patterns. Several species became increasingly nocturnal despite the darker nights, while others abandoned nighttime activity almost entirely. Birds began arriving weeks earlier or later than historical records suggested. Forests developed a different rhythm, subtle enough that tourists might never notice, yet unmistakable to anyone who had lived among these mountains for decades. The earth was teaching itself a new cadence. Life resisted extinction not by preserving the past, but by negotiating with the future. I never completely solved the mystery of the moving lights. Neither did anyone else. Eventually, observatories acknowledged their existence publicly, describing them as transient luminous objects associated with the expanding lunar debris field. The phrase sounded wonderfully scientific while explaining almost nothing. Hundreds of observatories photographed them, thousands of amateur astronomers tracked them, papers were published, conferences convened, simulations improved. Every year the explanations became more sophisticated while remaining only marginally more satisfying. Perhaps they were electrically charged dust concentrations interacting with the solar wind. Perhaps fragments rich in volatile compounds reflected sunlight unpredictably. Perhaps entirely new orbital phenomena had emerged around the departing moon. Science continued doing what science has always done, collecting better evidence while refusing to become emotionally attached to premature conclusions. I admired that discipline more than ever. The dark object my camera had captured remained even more elusive. For months I doubted the photograph myself. Then similar images emerged from observatories in Chile, Australia, South Africa, and northern Scandinavia. None possessed enough resolution to identify the object conclusively. None agreed perfectly regarding its trajectory. Some researchers argued that the apparent movement resulted from processing artifacts introduced, while compensating for the moon's changing orbit. Others insisted something genuinely occupied the space beyond the debris stream. Arguments continued for years. They may continue long after I'm gone. That, too, seemed strangely comforting. Mystery has always accompanied discovery. Every generation mistakes unanswered questions for failures instead of invitations. Winter arrived earlier than expected. The first major snowfall buried the valley in extraordinary silence, smoothing over the scars left by weeks of uncertainty. Fresh snow possesses a remarkable generosity. It covers disturbed earth, broken branches, abandoned tire tracks, and half-finished repairs with equal kindness. Standing on the deck one morning beneath a pale sky, I almost convinced myself that the world had forgiven itself. The mountains remained magnificent. The creek still found its way between the rocks. Smoke rose gently from my chimney into perfectly still air. For a few precious minutes, everything appeared ordinary. Then I looked up. Where the full moon had once dominated winter nights, now hung a distant white light, little brighter than an exceptionally brilliant planet. I realized I could cover it completely with the tip of my little finger. That simple observation affected me more profoundly than any government announcement or scientific paper had managed. Measurements and graphs speak to the intellect. Scale speaks directly to memory. Somewhere beyond that tiny white point floated the footprints left by astronauts more than a century earlier, the silent landing sites, the abandoned rovers, the laser reflectors, the flags that no longer represented nations so much as humanity itself. They had not moved. We had not moved. Only the distance between us had grown. Late one evening, nearly a year after the impact, I climbed once more to the rocky overlook above the cabin, carrying nothing except a folding chair and a thermos of coffee. The observatory camera continued its patient work below. The batteries hummed quietly in the workshop. The valley lay buried beneath snow that reflected the stars with astonishing clarity. I sat there for hours, thinking less about engineering than about perspective. Throughout my career, I had believed that understanding a system granted some measure of control over it. It is an appealing philosophy because it rewards curiosity and discipline, yet the greatest lesson of the previous year had been almost the opposite. Understanding does not guarantee control. Sometimes it merely grants the privilege of appreciating the scale of what cannot be controlled. Just before midnight, I noticed the moon emerging above the eastern ridge. Tiny, beautiful, unreachable. Behind it stretched the faint silver ribbon that had become as familiar as any constellation. I raised the binoculars almost absent-mindedly. The moving lights were still there, fainter now, more widely dispersed. Whether they represented ordinary physics patiently revealing itself or mysteries not yet imagined, I could no longer say. Then my eyes wandered beyond them, far beyond them, toward the place where my camera had once recorded the impossible geometry hidden among the stars. I expected to see nothing. Instead, I found only darkness. Not the darkness of fear, not the darkness of ignorance, simply the immense, patient darkness that had always surrounded our little world while we busied ourselves believing the familiar arrangement of sky, sea, and stone would continue forever. I lowered the binoculars and smiled for the first time in many months. Not because humanity had escaped tragedy. We had not. Not because I believed everything would somehow return to normal. It would not. I smiled because I finally understood something my profession had spent decades trying to teach me in smaller ways. No engineer truly builds permanence. We build continuity. We give the next generation something stable enough to stand upon before they confront problems we cannot yet imagine. The moon had done exactly that for billions of years. Its work was finished. Ours was only beginning. As I sat beneath a sky that had become both stranger and more honest than the one I had known for nearly 7 decades, I finished the last of my coffee and listened to the quiet breathing of the mountains. Somewhere below, the creek continued its endless conversation with gravity. adapting one bend, one ripple, one stone at a time. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, indifferent to human expectations, yet generous enough to remain visible. And I realized that survival had never been about preserving the world exactly as we remembered it. Survival had always been the willingness to learn the rules of the world that arrived next. When I finally stood to return to the cabin, I looked once more toward the tiny departing moon. It no longer felt as though it was abandoning us. It felt as though it had become another star. And for the first time since the asteroid struck, the silence no longer sounded like the end of the story. It sounded like the beginning of another one.